The courtroom smelled of old paper and quiet desperation. It was a smell Leo had come to know well over the past year, a scent that clung to the worn-out wool of his public defender's suit and the cheap polyester of the one he was wearing now. The suit was too big, a hand-me-down from a charity drive, the sleeves falling a good inch past his wrists. It made him feel like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes, a thought that brought a familiar sharp ache to his chest. Scuffed linoleum floors, rows of wooden benches that had held the weight of countless anxious bodies, and a long streak of water damage on the ceiling that looked like a weeping gray sky. A single, dusty window let in a slice of pale afternoon light, illuminating a galaxy of dancing dust motes. Up front, the machinery of justice was grinding through its afternoon shift. The court clerk, a woman with a tired beehive and eyes that had seen it all, typed with a relentless, clacking rhythm. The prosecutor, a young man with a face that was already losing its optimism, shuffled through a stack of files, searching for the one that mattered. At the defendant's table, Leo's own lawyer, Mr. Gable, sat with a kind of practiced stillness. He had a mound of files in front of him, but Leo knew his case wasn't in any of them. For Mr. Gable, this was just another Tuesday, another kid who'd done something stupid and was about to pay the price. He'd given Leo the same speech he'd given 100 others. Be respectful, say you're sorry, let me do the talking. We'll get you the best we can. Leo nodded along, but his mind was a million miles away. It was a year ago, almost to the day. The news had come not in a phone call, but in the way the world seemed to suddenly lose its color. The fire. That's what they called it. A faulty wire in the old house. A tragic accident. He remembered the heat on his face from a block away, smell of burning plastic and something else. Something he couldn't name at the time, but now knew was the smell of his entire life turning to ash. His father, a man who could fix anything with his hands and who always smelled like sawdust and coffee, was gone. Just like that. And in the hollow, echoing silence that followed, grief had curdled into a rage so hot it felt like a second heart beating inside his chest. That rage is what landed him here, in this tired room. A can of spray paint, a government wall, a torrent of words that screamed out a pain he couldn't put into words. Felony vandalism. His eyes drifted from his lawyer's tired face to the bench. The Honorable Judge Haas. He was a landmark in this city, as much a part of its architecture as the old courthouse itself. The local paper had done a profile on him last year for his 30th anniversary on the bench. Judge Robert Haas, a pillar of justice, the headline had read. The article showed pictures of him through the years, his hair darkening to gray, his face growing sturdier, but his eyes always the same, clear, steady. And full of a certainty that Leo both envied and hated, he sat now in his high-backed chair, a king on his throne. His black robes were immaculate, his silver hair perfectly combed. He had a kind of gravitas, a quiet power that filled the room. When he spoke, people listened. When he looked at you, you felt seen, truly seen, in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. He was the man the city turned to sort out its messes, a human scale for its problems. People trusted him. They believed in him. The proceedings droned on. Your Honor, the defendant has entered a guilty plea to 1 count of felony vandalism. While we acknowledge the defendant is a first-time offender and has experienced significant personal loss, the state must emphasize the seriousness of this crime. The defacement of public property is not a victimless act. We are asking for a sentence of 6 months in county jail, 3 years probation, and full restitution for the cost of cleanup. Leo barely heard the words. They were just sounds, like the buzz of a fly against a window pane. His focus was entirely on the man behind the bench. He studied the way Judge Haas held his chin, the slight downward tilt of his head as he listened. The way his fingers, long and elegant, rested on the polished wood. These were the hands his father had written about. These were the hands of the man who, according to a letter Leo found, tucked away in a box of old tools, had been having an affair with his mother years ago. A man his father had planned to expose for taking kickbacks from city contractors. A man who, according to that last desperate letter, would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. The fear was a cold, heavy thing in Leo's stomach. It had been there for a year, a constant companion. He was 19. He was a kid. A kid who spray-painted a wall because he didn't know how else to make the world hear his scream. He could just sit here, take his sentence, and disappear. It would be so much easier. The thought was a temptation, a whisper of peace. But then he would see the flame in his mind's eye and hear his father's laugh, and the guilt of staying silent would crush him. His lawyer stood. Mr. Gable's voice was smooth, it's polished from years of practice. Your Honor, the state is correct. He has, as mentioned, suffered a devastating loss with the passing of his father in a tragic house fire last year. This was an act of grief, a cry for help from a young man who was drowning in sorrow. We asked the court for leniency, a suspended sentence, with mandatory community service and counseling. We believe that is a more appropriate path than incarceration, which will only serve to harden a young man who is already deeply wounded. Judge Haas nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He picked up Leo's file, a thin, insignificant-looking folder. He opened it, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the rustle of paper as he read the pre-sentencing report. Leo watched his every move. He saw the judge's eyes scan the page, taking in the pathetic details of his life, the part-time job at the auto body shop, the mediocre grades, the single parent, the tragic fire. He was just another statistic, just another sad story in a long line of them. The judge probably felt a familiar pang of pity, a flicker of compassion for the misguided youth before him. He had no idea. The judge closed the file and placed it back on the bench. He looked out over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the empty benches before coming to rest on Leo. His face was stern, but not cruel. It was the face of a teacher about to deliver a difficult lesson. Mr. Martinez, he began, his voice deep and resonant, filling the small space. You stand before me today having admitted to a serious offense. While I have taken into account your personal circumstances and your lack of a prior criminal record, the court cannot ignore the gravity of your actions. You broke the law. You expressed your pain by causing harm to your community. That is not the answer. Paused, letting the words sink in. He was building up to it, the final, crushing weight of the law. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of the judge's voice. The bailiff standing by the door shifted his weight, his hand resting near his belt, ready for whatever came next. This was the moment of truth. Before I pass sentence, the judge said, his tone softening slightly, the court will afford you the opportunity to address this court. Is there anything you wish to say, Mr. Martinez? His lawyer gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Say no. Say you're sorry. Let's get this over with. But Leo wasn't looking at his lawyer. He was looking at the judge's hand. The judge had reached for his pen to sign the sentencing order. It was a handsome pen, a heavy-looking silver fountain pen. As it caught the light from the window, Leo saw it. The clasp on the cap, a small, ornate snake, its body coiled as if ready to strike. The breath caught in Leo's throat. His father's letter had been so clear. He's vain about his intellect. He carries a silver pen, a fancy one. He thinks it makes him look important. The clasp is a silver snake. I saw him using it at the club. He'll never be without it. It's his pride. It was him. The proof was right there, sitting on a polished piece of mahogany in the hand of the most powerful man in the room. The fear, the cold knot in his stomach, didn't go away. But beneath it, something hot and hard began to glow. It was the rage from that night, but it was no longer a fire consuming him. It was a forge shaping him, giving him a spine of steel. There was only the judge and the pen and the memory of his father's handwriting. This was it. The day he had been dreaming of and dreading for a full year. The judge lifted the gavel, ready to pronounce his fate. But Leo knew that the only fate that mattered today was the one he was about to hand down. Asterisk, the gavel. A small block of dark, polished wood hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. It was an extension of the judge's hand, a symbol of absolute power in this tired room. To everyone watching, it was simply the tool of a man about to do his job, to deliver a sentence and close a case file. To Leo, it was the hammer that was about to seal his silence, the final nail in the coffin of his father's story. He saw his lawyer, Mr. Gable, tense up, ready for the sharp crack of wood on wood that would end this whole miserable affair. Asterisk, but that sound never came. Instead, Leo's chair scraped against the linoleum floor, a screech of metal on worn-out tile that cut through the quiet hum of the courtroom. He stood up. His knees felt like they were made of jelly, and the oversized suit suddenly felt 100 pounds heavier. Trying to pull him back down into the safety of his seat, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room snap to him, the clerk, the prosecutor, the single-board reporter in the back row. He could feel Mr. Gable's panicked gaze, a silent, screaming command to sit down, to shut up, to not make things any worse than they already were. Leo ignored it all. He kept his focus locked on the man behind the bench. Judge Haas paused, the gavel still held aloft. An annoyed frown creased his forehead, a tiny crack in the mask of judicial authority. This was an unwelcome interruption. This was a procedural hiccup. Mr. Martinez, the judge's voice was a low rumble, a warning shot across the bow. You will remain seated. We are in the process of sentencing. But Leo didn't sit. He placed his trembling hands flat on the defense table, as if trying to anchor himself to the earth. He took a breath, and the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of a year's worth of unspoken words. His voice, when it came out, was thin, cracked, like ice breaking on a frozen pond. Your Honor, he started, and the words felt foreign in his own mouth, too formal for the raw, guttural thing he needed to say. He cleared his throat and tried again, his eyes still fixed on the judge's face. I don't have anything to say about the sentencing. The judge's frown deepened. He looked over at Mr. Gable, who had turned a shade of pale that made his suit look even more faded. The judge's expression was clear. Control your client. Mr. Martinez, the judge said, his voice dropping lower, losing its formality and taking on a sharper, more dangerous edge. This is your one and only opportunity to speak on your own behalf before I impose a sentence that will affect your future. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. Leo had thought about his next words for 365 days. He had said them to his reflection in the bathroom mirror, whispered them into his pillow at night, and screamed them at the wall of his tiny, one-room apartment until his throat was raw. But saying them here now, in front of him, was a different kind of terror. You said you'd listen, Leo said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. He leaned forward over the table, his knuckles white. You said I could address the court? So I am. The judge stared at him, his patience visibly fraying. He was a man who commanded respect, who was used to order, who was not accustomed to being defied by a teenage boy in an ill-fitting suit. He was about to shut it down, to call the bailiff, and have the boy forcibly seated. But before he could, Leo did something that stunned the room into a deeper silence. He looked away from the judge's face for the first time and stared directly at the object in his hand. That pen, Leo said, his voice suddenly louder, cutting through the tension. The one you're holding. For the briefest of seconds, the judge's eyes darted down to the silver fountain pen in his grasp. It was an involuntary movement, a glance that lasted no more than a fraction of a second. But in that fraction of a second, Leo saw it. Not of annoyance, not of anger, but of something else. Something pure and primal. Fear. It was like catching a glimpse of a wild animal in the woods. A flash of its eyes before it bolted back into the shadows. And just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the familiar, hard mask of indignation. This is completely inappropriate. The judge boomed, his voice echoing off the water-stained ceiling. He slammed the gavel down, not in finality, but in a sharp, angry crack that made everyone jump. This is a court of law, not a marketplace for your strange observations. You will address your actions, not my personal property. But the dam had broken. Seeing that flicker of fear, no matter how small, had given Leo the one thing he'd been missing: confirmation. It wasn't just a letter. It wasn't just the angry, grieving fantasy of a son who missed his father. It was real. "It's not a strange observation," Leo shot back, his voice no longer trembling. It was steady, fueled by a righteous fire that was finally consuming his fear. He pushed himself up, his hands now gripping the edge of the table so hard he thought it might splinter. "That pen was my father's. It's the one you used to sign the order that started the fire that killed him." The words hung in the air, each one a solid, heavy thing that refused to dissipate. The courtroom, which had been so sleepy and routine, now felt like a tinderbox, and Leo had just struck a match. The single reporter in the back row dropped his notepad. Even the bailiff, a man who had probably seen it all, froze, his hand hovering inches from his side. The judge was a statue. He didn't move, didn't speak. His face, usually a careful, composed mask, was now a canvas of clashing emotions: shock, denial, and underneath it all, that same cold panic that had flickered in his eyes before. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "He knew about you," Leo pressed on, his voice rising with each word, a crescendo of a year's worth of pain. "He knew you were taking money from those contractors. He was going to write about it. He had the proof. And you thought you could stop him. You thought a fire would be enough to bury him in everything he knew." He wasn't shouting anymore. His voice was low, intense, and it carried a weight that made every person in the room lean forward to hear. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a witness. He was a prosecutor. "My father didn't die in an accident," Leo said, his voice cracking on the last word, the grief finally breaking through the wall of rage. He could feel tears welling in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall. "You killed him. You are a murderer." The word murderer was like a physical blow. It seemed to reverberate off the walls, bouncing off the judge's bench and settling over the room like a shroud. The judge finally found his voice, but it was no longer the voice of a pillar of the community. It was the desperate, sputtering roar of a cornered man. "Order. Order in this court," he bellowed, slamming the gavel down again and again, the frantic, rhythmic sound of a man trying to beat back the tide. "Bailiff, remove this man from my courtroom, contempt. I'm holding him in contempt." But the order was too late. The courtroom had already erupted. It wasn't a violent eruption, but a chaotic one. The reporter in the back was already on his phone, hissing frantically into the receiver. A couple in the gallery, who were there for another case, were now standing up, their eyes wide, pointing. The prosecutor was on his feet, his face a picture of total disbelief. Mr. Gable. Leo's lawyer was just sitting there, his head in his hands, as if he were watching a train crash in slow motion. The bailiff, a large, barrel-chested man, started moving towards Leo. "Come on, son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Don't make this worse." Leo didn't resist. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He had done what he came to do. He had thrown the stone into the pond, and now all he could do was watch the ripples spread. He allowed the bailiff to take his arm, his body feeling suddenly light, hollowed out. As he was turned away from the judge and led toward the side door, he risked one last look back. Judge Haas had stopped pounding the gavel. He was standing now, his robes hanging loosely from his shoulders. But his hand, the hand that had held the silver pen, was trembling uncontrollably at his side. It was a small movement, a tell so tiny that Leo doubted anyone else in the room even noticed it. But he did, and in that moment he knew. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. Asterisk, the heavy oak door to the courtroom slammed shut behind Leo, the sound echoing in the sterile cinder-block hallway. It was a final, definitive punctuation mark. For a moment, there was only silence, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just unleashed. The bailiff's grip on his arm was firm, not angry, but methodical. As he led him away from the door and toward the rear of the courthouse, they walked past a small group of people waiting for the next case, their faces a mixture of confusion and morbid curiosity. They had heard the shouting, the sudden explosion of sound from behind the closed door. They looked at Leo, a skinny kid in a baggy suit. and then at the grim-faced bailiff, and their imaginations filled in the blanks. Leo's mind was blank. He felt detached, as if he were watching himself from a distance, a ghost walking his own body down the hall. The adrenaline that had carried him through his outburst had fled, leaving behind a profound and trembling exhaustion. He had done it. The words were out. He could feel the phantom weight of them on his tongue. He had stood up in the most frightening room in the city and called the most powerful man there a murderer. And for a fleeting second, it had felt like power. Now, it just felt like a mistake. Asterisk the bailiff led him not to a holding cell, but to a small, windowless interview room. It was a bleak space, furnished with a metal table and 2 chairs, all bolted to the floor. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The bailiff released his arm, pointed to a chair, and said, "Sit tight. Someone will be in to talk to you." Then he left, locking the heavy door behind him with a loud, metallic click. The click echoed the sound in Leo's own heart. A door closing. An ending. He sank into the chair, the metal cold against his back through the thin fabric of his suit. He brought his hands up to his face. They were shaking. He had expected to feel something else. Relief, maybe? Or pride. But all he felt was a vast, hollow ache. The courtroom had been a stage, and he had played his part with a fire he didn't know he possessed. But the play was over. The stage was empty. The vibration of his own frantic heartbeat humming through the surface. What had he done? He had just thrown away any chance of a quiet life. He had thrown himself onto the tracks of a speeding train. A man like Judge Haas, a man with connections and a pristine reputation, wouldn't just let something like this slide. He would crush Leo. He would grind him into dust. And the worst part was, who would ever believe him? A 19-year-old vandal with a ghost story against. A man who had been the face of justice in this city for 30 years. Outside the locked door, a storm was breaking. The noise from the hallway was no longer muffled. It was a crescendo of shouts, running feet, and the insistent, repeated trill of a ringing phone. Leo could hear snippets of conversations, fragments of the tornado he had created. Did he really say that? To the judge's face? "I'm getting calls from the national papers. They want a quote from the court. ... Lock down the entire floor. No one in or out without clearance." And then, a voice he recognized. His lawyer, Mr. Gable. His voice was usually so smooth, so controlled. Now it was high with panic. "Let me talk to him. He's my client. You can't just lock him up like an animal." Another voice, stern and official, cut him off. "He's in contempt of a federal judge, counselor. He's not your client right now. He's a suspect. And we have a situation. Suspect." The words hit Leo like a physical blow. He wasn't just a troublemaker anymore. He was a suspect in something much, much bigger. He lifted his head from the table and looked at his reflection in the one-way mirror on the opposite wall. He saw a pale, scared kid with wide, terrified eyes. The hero from the courtroom had vanished. After what felt like hours, the lock on the door clicked again. The door opened, but it wasn't a guard or a lawyer who stepped in. It was a woman. She was young, maybe a few years older than him, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to be cataloging every detail of the room, of him in a single glance. She was dressed casually, in jeans and a simple sweater, and she carried a worn leather satchel over her shoulder. She didn't look like a lawyer or a cop. She looked like a student. But she held herself with a quiet confidence that immediately commanded the room. She didn't offer a hand. She just pulled out the other metal chair, scraping it loudly across the floor, and sat down across from him.
"You're Leo,"
she said. It wasn't a question. He just nodded, his throat too dry to speak. "They told me you asked for me," she said, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos beyond the door. "My name is Anya. I write for the city paper." Leo's mind raced. He hadn't asked for anyone. But then he remembered. In the few seconds of chaos before the bailiff had grabbed him, he had seen the one reporter in the back row, the young woman with the short, dark hair, and the look on her face that wasn't just curiosity, but recognition. She had seen something. "I didn't ask for you, Leo," managed to croak out. "No, you didn't," Anya agreed, reaching into her satchel and pulling out a small spiral-bound notepad and a pen. "You didn't have to. You shouted it in a room full of people." "I'm just the only one who knew it might be true." Leo stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Anya flipped open her notepad, but she didn't write anything down. She just rested her pen on the page. "My editor sent me to cover the sentencing today. Routine stuff." "A tragic story," he said. "Sad kid, grieving father, bad choices." "But your name sounded familiar." "Leo Martinez. David Martinez's son." She paused, letting the name hang in the air between them. The mention of his father's name was a splash of cold water. "My first big story as a junior reporter here was a profile on the city's longest-serving public servants," she continued, her voice quiet. "Judge Haas was the centerpiece. I spent weeks in his archive room, looking through old files, trying to piece together his career. That's where I found it. A sealed civil case from 12 years ago. A dispute between a contractor and the city. The contractor claimed the city, under a specific committee, had shorted his payments. The lawsuit was dismissed for lack of evidence. The presiding judge on the case was Robert Haas, the contractor who filed the lawsuit. He was your father's business partner for years." Leo's heart started to pound again, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. "My dad never talked about any lawsuit." "Because it wasn't a lawsuit," Anya said, leaning forward slightly. "It was a threat. I found letters in the file. Your father's partner was trying to expose a kickback scheme. He was trying to get money that was owed to him. The letter named names. It hinted at a judge who was paid to look the other way. That judge's name wasn't on the letter, but the lawsuit was assigned to Haas, and it was dismissed so fast it made my head spin. A few months later, your partner's workshop burns down. A faulty wire. A few months after that, your father's house burns down. Also, a faulty wire. You see the pattern?" Leo didn't just see it. It was the pattern he had been living in for a year, a shape he could never fully describe until this moment. She had found it. She had found the thread. He had only been clutching at the frayed ends. "Ah!" "They called him a pillar of the community," Leo whispered, the words tasting like poison. "They call a lot of people that," Anya said, a hard edge to her voice. "The question is, what's the community built on?" She finally uncapped her pen. "I've been sitting on this story for a year. I had the pattern. I had the suspicion. But I didn't have the smoking gun. A pattern isn't enough to take on someone like Robert Haas. It's my word against his. And his is a lot louder." She looked him directly in the eyes. "Until today, you didn't just give me a story, Leo. You gave me a headline. You gave me a witness. The thing about the pen, you were right about it, weren't you? You saw it and you knew." Leo could only nod, the tears he had fought back in the courtroom finally spilling over and running down his cheeks. They weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of release. For the first time in a year, he wasn't alone. The weight on his shoulders, the one that had been crushing him, felt just a little bit lighter. Outside, the sounds of chaos had begun to organize into the clatter of a full-blown investigation. A different kind of storm was now raging outside, one not born of a single outburst, but of a truth that refused to stay buried. Anya stood up, slipping her notepad back into her satchel. "I have to go," she said. "This is going to get very big very fast. They're probably going to try to keep you isolated, make you out to be a crazy, grieving kid who snapped. Don't talk to anyone but a lawyer. I mean someone who isn't afraid to burn this whole thing down." She walked to the door and knocked. The lock clicked. Before she opened it, she turned back to him one last time. "You did a brave thing in there, Leo. Stupid and reckless, but brave. You just picked a fight with a giant. Now, let's go slay it." The door opened, and she was gone, leaving Leo alone again in the sterile room. But it was a different kind of alone. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of a single, impossible word and the glimmer of a possibility. A possibility that the man in the black robes wasn't a pillar, but just a man. And men, as his father had always taught him, can be made to fall. Asterisk, the first 24 hours after the outburst were a blur of gray walls and muffled sounds. Leo was moved from the small interview room to a standard holding cell in the basement of the courthouse. It was a concrete box with a metal bench and a toilet in the corner, a place designed to make you feel small and forgotten. He wasn't treated like a defendant in contempt anymore. He was treated like a threat. A different set of guards, more stern and less talkative, brought him his meals. They watched him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The kind you'd give a sleeping volcano you weren't quite sure was dormant. No one would tell him anything. His requests to see a lawyer were met with a flat. "We're processing that." I had no concept of time. There was no window in his cell. Day and night were just different degrees of buzzing from the fluorescent lights overhead. He spent the long hours replaying the scene in the courtroom, trying to remember the look on the judge's face, the sound of his own voice, the clatter of the gavel. The initial, terrifying certainty he felt had been eroded by the monotony of the cell, replaced by a creeping doubt. What if he was wrong? What if Anya, the reporter, was just spinning a story, seeing what she wanted to see? What if he had just thrown his life away based on a letter from a grieving father and the frantic scribblings of a journalist hungry for a break? On the third day, the cell door clanged open. It was a man Leo didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, with a face full of sharp angles and a suit that looked like it cost more than Leo's entire apartment building. He had an aura of sharp, clean energy, a stark contrast to the weary, worn-down people Leo was used to dealing with. "You're Leo?" the man said, his voice crisp and efficient. It wasn't a question. He stepped into the cell and offered a hand. "My name is Richard. Anya hired me. I'm your new lawyer." Leo just stared at the hand. He couldn't process it. "My lawyer is Mr. Gable." "Mr. Gable is a good man who handles plea bargains for shoplifters," Richard said, lowering his hand without taking offense. "You are far beyond his pay grade. He called me himself, said you were in over your head. He was right. Now stand up. We're leaving. Leaving. Where are we going?" "We're going to my car, then we're going to a secure location." "And we are going to talk," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He handed Leo a clean, folded set of clothes, a hoodie, jeans, a new pair of sneakers. "Put these on. Let's ditch the I lost a bet with my dad's suit." As they walked through the quiet corridors of the courthouse, the world outside had already changed. The familiar, sleepy building was now under siege. A throng of reporters and camera crews were camped out on the front steps, their microphones like a forest of metal trees. They swarmed the entrance, their shouts a chaotic mix of questions. "Leo, did you mean it? Can you tell us what evidence you have? Is the judge a killer?" Richard, a man who looked like he'd be more comfortable in a boardroom, became a human shield. He moved with a practiced ease, parting the sea of reporters with a few firm, repeated words. No comment. All in due time. He ushered Leo into the back of a sleek, black sedan, and as the tinted windows slid up, the noise of the world faded to a dull hum. "Welcome to the show," Richard said, peeling out into traffic. "Your accusation didn't just cause a ripple, Leo. You dropped a depth charge. This is a national story now. Judge Haas has temporarily stepped down from the bench, citing medical leave. The Department of Justice has opened a formal inquiry into the death of your father and his business partner." The vultures are circling. Leo just watched the city blur past the window. It felt like he was watching a movie about someone else's life. "They believe me?" "They don't have to believe you," Richard corrected. "Anya's story has forced them to act. She was very thorough. She didn't just run with your accusation. She laid out the timeline, the dismissed lawsuit, the 2 accidental fires. She created a pattern so compelling it would be irresponsible for the authorities to ignore. But believing you and proving it are 2 different things. Right now to the world, you are a grieving, traumatized kid who made a wild accusation. To Haas and his allies, you are the biggest threat they've ever faced. They are already digging into your life, trying to find anything they can to discredit you. Your fight with the landlord last month? That's now a sign of your violent tendencies. The D you got in chemistry? Proof you're not a reliable witness. They will destroy you if we let them." Richard wasn't trying to scare him. He was just laying out the battlefield. For the first time, Leo felt a sliver of something other than fear or rage. He felt clarity. He had an ally. He had a plan. "Anya said you would know what to do," Leo said softly. "Anya is a good reporter, but she's not a miracle worker," Richard said. "She started the fire, but we need to provide the fuel to keep it burning. And she gave me the key. She told me about the letter your father left for you, the one you found in the toolbox." Leo felt a familiar pang in his chest. He hadn't read the letter since that first night. The words too painful, too big. He had memorized the parts that mattered the affair. The kickbacks, the snake Penbert. He had pushed the rest away. "He said he hid proof," Richard continued, his eyes on the road. "Proof that would ruin Haas if anything ever happened to him. He didn't say what it was, but he said where it was. He said it was under the growing oak." Leo's breath hitched. He remembered those words. They had been the most confusing part of the letter, the part he'd dismissed as the ramblings of a desperate man. They had no oak tree in their yard. Just a patchy lawn and an old shed. "The old house is still there, right?" Richard asked. "Condemned, but still standing," Leo nodded. "The city hasn't torn it down yet." "Good," Richard said, a flicker of a smile on his lips. "Tonight, we go get that proof." Richard drove them to the old neighborhood, a place that felt like a ghost of Leo's childhood. The streets were quiet and empty under a sickly yellow glow from the streetlights. The house was a dark, skeletal silhouette against the sky. The charred part of the roof where the fire had been most intense was a gaping wound. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with waist-high weeds. Seeing it again was like a punch to the gut. It was the skeleton of his old life. They climbed the low chain-link fence, the metal groaning in the quiet night. The backyard was a jungle. Richard had a flashlight, and its narrow beam cut through the darkness. Its door hanging crookedly on its hinges. "The growing oak," Leo whispered, mostly to himself. He walked past the shed to the far corner of the yard, where the shadows were deepest. There was nothing there but a thick patch of weeds and a rotted old tree stump he used to sit on as a kid. He felt a fresh wave of disappointment. Maybe his father had just been writing nonsense, a desperate plea for a son to believe in him. "What's this?" Richard asked, his flashlight beam landing on the stump. It wasn't just a stump. As they got closer, they could see that a new, slender sapling was growing right out of the center of the old dead wood, a new life rising from the old. It wasn't an oak, but it was growing. "He always said you were stubborn like a weed," Leo said, a memory surfacing of his father laughing at a stubborn dandelion pushing through a crack in the driveway. He looked at the sapling, a feeling of understanding washing over him. "This is the growing oak. They gotta work." With a shovel Richard had brought from the car, they began digging around the base of the old stump. The earth was hard and dry, and the work was silent and sweaty. It felt like digging for a treasure, but one that was already theirs. After about 30 minutes of digging, the shovel hit something hard. Not rock. Metal. It was a small, strong box, the kind you might buy at a hardware store to store important documents. It was heavy, and it was locked. Leo's heart started to pound. This was it. This was the thing his father had died for. "Stand back," Richard said, taking a small crowbar from the car. He wedged it into the lid of the box and pulled. The wood groaned and splintered, but the lock held. He tried again, putting his weight into it. With a loud crack, the lid popped open. Inside, nestled on a bed of old, discolored newspaper clippings, were two things. The first was a thick, spiral-bound ledger. The pages were filled with neat, tidy columns of numbers, dates, and names. It was his father's meticulous record of the kickbacks. A spiderweb of money trails connecting shell companies to city projects, all pointing back to the judge. It was the paper trail. The second item was smaller, stranger. It was a single, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a small, folded square of paper. On the paper there was a single, faint gray smudge. A fingerprint. Richard carefully lifted the bag, holding it up to the flashlight. He didn't need to explain. Leo knew what it was. His father had gotten close enough to get a sample. close enough to lift the judge's print from a document he had signed, a document likely connected to the scheme. His father had been a journalist, a detail man. He wouldn't just make an accusation. He would bring proof. "This is it, Leo," Richard said, his voice hushed with awe. "This isn't just a smoking gun. This is the entire arsenal. The ledger shows the motive, the crime, the fingerprint. This connects the judge directly to it." They stood there in the dark, holding the evidence that had been buried for a year. It felt less like a victory and more like a homecoming. They weren't just digging up a box. They were digging up the truth that had been buried with his father. And as they closed the box and prepared to leave, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness from the street, followed by another and another. They weren't alone. The vultures weren't just circling in the media. They were here, on the ground, and they were watching. The real battle had just begun. The headlights were like 3 sets of predatory eyes in the darkness, cutting across the overgrown yard. For a heart-stopping second, Leo and Richard were frozen in the twin beams of light, the open strongbox between them like a treasure chest on a pirate map they weren't supposed to have. Richard's hand instinctively went to Leo's arm, not to restrain him, but to steady him. His grip was firm and calm, a silent command not to run. "Don't move," Richard whispered, his voice a low, steady hum that somehow cut through the pounding in Leo's ears. "They're just watching. They want to know what we found. If we run, they'll chase. If we stay, they'll have to make the first move." The cars didn't move. They just sat there, engines idling, silhouettes against the distant glow of the streetlights. They weren't police cars. They were dark, anonymous sedans. The kind of car a powerful man might use when he wanted to remain invisible. Judge Haas's people. They weren't here to arrest them. They were here to intimidate them, or worse. After a moment that stretched into a small eternity, one of the cars switched off its headlights, plunging that corner of the yard back into shadow. It was a signal, a warning. Then, just as quietly as they had arrived, the 3 cars pulled away and vanished down the street. Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Okay, that changes things. He knows we're here. He knows we have something. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. He didn't talk on the drive back. The box sat on Leo's lap, and he could feel the weight of it, a tangible piece of his father's last stand. He felt a strange mix of elation and dread. They had the proof. But the headlights had proven that the danger was also real. This wasn't just a story in the paper anymore. This was a fight, and the other side had just shown they were willing to play dirty. They met Anya in a sterile, 24-hour diner at 3 a.m. The place was empty, save for a tired-looking cook flipping a single pancake behind the counter. Anya was already in a corner booth, a laptop open, several empty coffee cups littering the table. She looked up as they slid in, her eyes going immediately to the metal box. "You got it?" she said. It wasn't a question. Her eyes were bright, electric with the thrill of the story. Richard slid the ledger across the table. Anya didn't touch it. She just looked at it, at the neat columns of numbers and names. "This is the why," she murmured, as if speaking to herself. Then her eyes fell on the evidence bag with the fingerprint. "And this is the how." "I don't understand," Leo said, his voice hoarse. "How does one fingerprint prove anything?" "It doesn't," Richard said, leaning forward, his voice low and intense. "Not on its own, but it's the key to the evidence locker. Anya, what's the old case file number for the civil suit your father filed?" Anya's fingers flew across her keyboard. "C11288B. It's in the city archive downtown." "Good," Richard said. "We get a different judge, of course, to issue a warrant to open that file. In that file, among the dismissed paperwork, we petition to have the forensics team run a comparison. And we tell them we expect a match to a partial lifted from this print. We tell them we expect a match to Judge Robert Haas." Leo stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. "The print my dad got. It wasn't just a random print. It was a print from a document in the case file." "Exactly," Richard confirmed. "Your father was brilliant. He didn't just take a random sample. He created a perfect chain of evidence. The print he lifted connects to a document in the case Haas presided over, a case that is now directly linked to 2 arson murders. He built a trap, and we just found the spring. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic legal maneuvering. And working the phones with a relentless energy that bordered on the supernatural. Anya, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of investigative journalism. She didn't publish the story of the strongbox. Instead, she wrote pieces about the growing mystery, about the DOJ investigation, about the mounting pressure on the former judge. She was stoking the flames, keeping the story in the national consciousness and making it impossible for the authorities to sweep it under the rug. Leo, in the middle of it all, felt strangely passive. He was the eye of the hurricane. He gave official statements, signed affidavits, and sat through hours of interviews with federal agents. He told them everything: the letter, the pen, the headlights in the yard. He felt like a machine, just repeating the facts. The story now so rehearsed, it felt like it had happened to someone else. The call came late on a Friday afternoon. Richard put it on speaker. The voice on the other end was a crisp federal agent. "It's a match," the agent said, his voice flat with the weight of the revelation. "We got the warrant, opened the file, and there it was. A partial from a contract signature dated 2 weeks before the partner's workshop fire. It's a 99.9% match to the print in your bag. We're moving in. We're arresting him now." The room was silent. Anya's eyes were wide, and she had a small, triumphant smile on her face. Richard just closed his eyes for a moment, a single, slow nod of satisfaction. Leo felt nothing. He just felt the air leave the room, as if a great pressure had been released. The news broke 10 minutes later. Every channel cut to a live shot. It was Judge Haas's house, the same one that had been featured in the newspaper profile. The neat, beautiful lawn was now a mess of unmarked cars and agents in dark suits. And then the door opened. Leo's breath caught in his throat. It was the same man he had seen in the courtroom, but he was utterly transformed. The authority, the gravitas, the air of unshakable confidence, it was all gone. He was just an old man. His clothes were disheveled, his hair was a mess, and his face was a pale, slack mask of defeat. The cameras flashed as 2 agents let him out in handcuffs. The metal a stark, cold reality against the wrinkled skin of his wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at the ground. A broken man being let out of his own kingdom. Leo was supposed to feel a surge of joy, a sense of victory. This wasn't a monster being defeated. This was just a man. A man who got greedy, who got scared, and who had done a terrible thing. And now his life was over. The legal aftermath was a whirlwind. The felony vandalism charge, of course, was dropped. The charges against Leo evaporated, and he was a free man. He appeared on news shows and gave interviews. They called him a hero, a young David who took down Goliath. He heard the phrase courageous so many times it began to lose all meaning. His own sentencing day arrived. But it wasn't in a courtroom. It was on the courthouse steps, surrounded by a scrum of reporters. He had agreed to give one last statement. Richard stood beside him, a steady hand on his shoulder. Anya was there too, her notebook in her hand. A colleague in the crowd, Leo looked out at the faces at the flashing cameras, felt a world of difference between this day and the one a few weeks ago. He took a breath, the air feeling clean for the first time in a year. "I don't feel like a hero," he said, his voice clear and steady, amplified by the dozen microphones pointed at him. "A hero is someone who does something brave. I was just a kid who was tired of being scared. I was a kid who missed his father." He paused, thinking of the letter, of the strongbox, of the risk his father had taken. He fought for the truth, and it cost him everything. "I was just the person who was lucky enough to find the map he left behind. This isn't a victory. It's just justice." He didn't say anything else. There was nothing more to say. He turned and walked away from the noise, Richard and Anya flanking him. He didn't look back at the courthouse, at the place that had held him captive, and then set him free. He just kept walking down the street, a 19-year-old kid in a hoodie, heading into a world that suddenly felt too big and too loud. He had his justice, but the price was a piece of his soul. He had faced the monster only to find it was just a man, and in doing so, he had lost the simple, comforting illusion of good versus evil. He was free, but he was not whole. He had won the war, but the battle scars would stay with him forever.